Are your podcast calls to action actually working? That is what we're going to talk about today, because it's really important that if you are going to the trouble to ask your audience to do something, you need to have the measurements and the data in place to make sure that they are doing what you've asked them to do. So let's get right to it. Hey y'all, Crystal here today, and if you are brand new to this channel, hello and welcome. I teach entrepreneurs all about how to start, launch, and market their podcast, and today I specifically wanted to talk about your podcast calls to action. We have this video right here that gives you 25 calls to action that any podcaster can make to give you some ideas, but the follow-up to that is, are your calls to action actually working? And there's a few ways to know this for sure, and I'm going to share 3 of them here with you today. So if you've been around here for a while, or even if you're brand new, you will quickly learn that I am a numbers nerd. It's one of those things that I'm super geeky about on top of podcasting and content and showing up with confidence. I love to understand where people are finding me, finding my content, and how I can better show up and serve them. But first, I have to know, how are they finding me? And one of the ways that I can measure this is actually step number 1 is when you're doing your podcast calls to action, you have to know, are people actually doing what you ask them to? So here's a great example. We have a free podcast community right here. This is the Proffitt Podcast online community. It's our free Facebook group, and I will have calls to action. I will do dynamic content ads. You can learn about what that is and how you can do free dynamic content with BUZZSPROUT right here. But I will have calls to action that say, hey, come join us in our free Facebook group. I do these several times throughout the year because I want people to join our community. I, for one, think that we have a lot of fun. There's a lot of great resources there, and we put posts Monday through Friday to help you in your podcast journey, and it's free. It's all 100% free. But what will happen is whenever you request to join our group, there's a few questions. If you're familiar with Facebook groups, you usually have to answer, do you agree to our rules? And what is your email address if you want to get on our email list? And one of the other things that I ask people is, how did you find us? How did you find this group? And since I started collecting this information for a few years now, I can scroll through all my answers. I have a Google sheet of the answers from people's how did you find us, and what's the one thing you want to learn about podcasting here in our community. And I have hundreds of responses of how people have found me. People have found me on the podcast. People have found me on my YouTube channel. People have found me through other programs and partnerships and different communities that I'm a part of. And this data is priceless. It's so priceless because I can see where people are finding me, but how people are interacting with my content out in the world, right? Because typically with a podcast, it can feel like you're speaking out into the void and you don't necessarily know how people are stumbling across your podcast. Did they hear you on a different podcast? Did they Google and they found your name or an episode that you did? So this information is so important. So number 1, are people actually taking action on the things that you're asking them to do? And there's a lot of different ways that you can measure this, but the number 1 thing for me is if I'm asking someone to join our Facebook group and they say, I heard about this on the Proffitt Podcast. This is my weekly show right here, and it's linked below. But if they say, I heard about this on the Proffitt Podcast, and I know my calls to action are working. It's actually working. People are doing what I asked them to do. So this is the next question that I would encourage you to ask whenever you're thinking about your calls to action. Are people saying they heard about it on your podcast, right? Because the first question is, are they doing what you asked them to do, right? Are people actually joining your Facebook group? Because I have a lot of podcasters that'll say, well, no one's joining my Facebook group. And I say, Did you ask them? Have you actually made that call to action and say, hey, here's how to join our group. Here's where you can find us. Because if you haven't done that, then you won't be able to measure where they did hear about the group because people aren't joining. I'm getting an influx of people constantly joining our Facebook group because I talk about it on here. I talk about it on my podcast. I will mention it in our weekly emails that I send out to my list. And I know that people are finding the group because, as you can see right here, lots of people have said they've heard about this particular group on the podcast. So that is how I know that that specific call to action is working. But I want you to tell me in the comments below, do you have a specific question about calls to action? Are you curious whether you can do something that's free or paid, or you want to know about self-sponsored ads? Like, tell me your questions about calls to action for your podcast, because we're creating some new content specifically about creating ads within your show that is promoting your own stuff. So it's not sponsored, it's not branded, it's not affiliated with anything other than your own business. So tell me in the comments below. Okay, let's get back to the video. Okay, and this third thing that I want to point out from the very beginning is a little bit more strategic, a little bit higher, like techie. It's not for very beginners. This is kind of leveling up. But if you're there, I encourage you to do this. If you are going to have specific calls to action on your podcast and you want to measure that information, you need to have a specific URL, right? Like a domain, crystalproffitt.com/podcast, whatever it is. You want to have something very specific that you will only say on your podcast. So you won't share that link on social media. You won't share it on YouTube. You won't maybe not even share it in your email list. You will only say it on your podcast. The reason why is you want to be able to measure, well, how many people are visiting that link? And you can look at this in your WordPress site, or if you have a short link like a bit.ly or a pretty link, you'd be able to measure these results. But I highly encourage you, if you're trying to get into the nitty-gritty of, are people actually doing what I asked them to do? Are they doing the thing on the podcast? And like, is this how they're hearing about this promotion or your freebie? Whatever you're trying to do, you've got to have a way to measure it. So the question of the day is, are your podcast calls to action working? Well, you need to ask a few more questions in order to make sure that they are working to your advantage. So let's do a quick recap. First question is, are people doing what you asked them to do? Well, that's pretty easy to tell. Did you ask them to follow you on Instagram? Are you growing your Instagram following? Did you ask them to come join you in your Facebook group? Is your Facebook group growing? These are the ways that you measure that. The second thing is, are they saying they heard about this particular thing, your call to action, that they heard about it on the podcast? And the way to have that system in place is if you have a Facebook group and you have like kind of a question answer area where people can tell you, oh, I heard about this from the Proffitt Podcast. That's a great way to measure that. And then the third thing is, are people clicking specific links that you only mention on your podcast? This is a great way to measure whether something is actually working, and you can set this up actually with your dynamic content within BuzzSPROUT. If you want to know more about dynamic content, you're like, what does she keep talking about? I'm going to have a few videos linked below, but BuzzSPROUT does a great job of giving you the ability to set up affiliate links that are custom to your brand and gives you the ability to do dynamic content. And you could set up this particular link and just share it in your dynamic content in BuzzSPROUT if you wanted to. But if you have any other questions about these higher strategies and you're just like, what is she even talking about? I encourage you to check out Proffitt Podcasting. This is my digital course where I teach you all about how to start, launch, and market your podcast. Whether you're brand new to podcasting or you've already been on this podcast journey, but you're like, I don't know that I did it right. Or I know how to record, but I don't really know how to market this thing. It just feels hard and clunky and there's a lot of friction. I encourage you to check out Proffitt Podcasting. You can actually go to crystalproffitt.com/course to check it out. We would love to have you join us. We have so much fun, and this is a program that has helped hundreds of podcasters get their show up and running in 30 days or less. But that's all I have for you today. So make sure you hit that thumbs up on this video if you found it helpful. Hit subscribe below. That way you don't miss our future videos that we put out every single week, all about podcasting and running your online business. Check out these videos right here that are going to be super helpful in your podcast journey. And as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.